When Dmitri first saw Elena Sergeyevna, he expected only formal politeness and the familiar comfort of family. The very thing every man imagines when he thinks of meeting his wife's parents, strict but kind, with tea on the table, conversations about the weather, and light questions about work, so as not to intrude on personal matters. He was 32 years old, his wife, Masha, 29. They had just married in a quiet ceremony in Zaxi, without unnecessary pomp. They had simply filed an application a month earlier, exchanged simple silver rings, and celebrated with loved ones at a modest table in a small café on the outskirts, where salads and shashlik were served, and the guests joked about how they had fallen into a trap. Her parents rented a room in an old apartment in the city center, in one of those panel buildings with peeling paint on the facade, creaking doors in the entryway that always smelled of fresh woodwork from the neighbors, and a narrow balcony cluttered with flower pots. They were looking for something of their own, something spacious, maybe with a balcony and a view of a park where they could stroll on weekends, until they figured out how to move. Life seemed stable but routine, like a clock ticking on the wall. His work from home was on the computer, drawing sketches for orders, sometimes at night, too. Meet deadlines when a client called with complaints. The shift worker at the cafe where she poured coffee chatted with regulars about their problems, and returned home with the smell of baked goods in her hair. Future plans: buying a used car to avoid the tram, having a child when things stabilized, plans that had always been put off until later, when he'd saved up for at least a down payment on an apartment. Recalling his first meeting with Masha 3 years ago, Dmitri smiled to himself. She worked at the same cafe he'd stopped at after an unsuccessful job interview. He'd ordered a black coffee without sugar, and she, with a shock of blonde hair and a playful smile, had winked. "Add milk, life is bitter enough as it is." It had seemed funny, light, like her laughter. And 6 months later, they were living together in a tiny rented apartment, arguing about whose turn it was to wash the dishes. And now, family, responsibility, and a meeting with his mother-in-law, whom he'd imagined as a strict woman, basking in old magazine advice. But Elena Sergeyevna turned out to be completely different from what he had imagined. Not the stern lady in an apron with a taciturn neighbor from the entrance, full of advice on how to run a household, save on groceries, or choose the right wallpaper. "Just call me Lena," she said when they met, extending her hand, her palm warm and calloused from work. She laughed, catching his surprised look, as if surprised by her own directness, as if the words had just slipped out without a filter. The woman looked younger than her years, 48, as Masha whispered, with a neat hairstyle, a few gray strands peeking through the dark curls pulled back into a low ponytail, and a light coat with a fur collar, smelling of the train, autumn rain, and distant roads, where she worked as an accountant at the branch, and there was a certain inner warmth about her, like an old family photo from an album that you want to flip through again and again, discovering new details, a smile, a glance, a hint of history. There were no stereotypes or family stories that Masha told, no fluttering about young people who ruin everything, who don't value traditions, any hint of control over their lives, how to spend money on unnecessary trifles or plan their day by the hour. She came back from a business trip for a couple of weeks to help with the new room, hang shelves on the wall, arrange the furniture they bought at the flea market, nothing more, as she said with a smile, adjusting her bag on her shoulder, so as not to interfere with your young life, but simply to be there if you need anything, to hammer a nail or share a recipe. Even in the first few days, Dmitri noticed how conversations with her stretched out, like an autumn evening when twilight lingers, and the leaves outside the window swirl in a slow dance in the gusts of wind, reminding him of something forgotten but important. Dreams from his youth that he had long ago shelved. In the kitchen, the smell of fresh bread from the nearest bakery on the corner, where there was always a line for hot lavash and poppy seed buns, which Masha loved to munch on in the mornings. They talked about old books Lena had brought back from a business trip in her tattered bag, Tom Dostoevsky with yellowed pages, where she'd put bookmarks and napkins, and Bulgakov, where she'd underlined lines in pencil. Shepcha, here he's talking about us, about people, and then about films, which Masha had long called boring and preferred light series about love in the big city with a fast-paced plot, kisses in the rain, and a happy ending per season.
Have you seen The Master and Margarita?
There's so much in every frame, so many shadows and light, so many mysteries, that you can rewatch it for years and each time. Find something new, just like in life, she said, slowly stirring the sugar in her cup with a spoon. And Dmitri Kieval, remembering how he himself once I read this at night as a student in a tiny dorm room where the light from the desk lamp fell on the pages.